It is a great privilege to welcome you all to this two-day training workshop on translation and culture. This workshop has been sponsored by Bharatiya Bhasha Samiti, Ministry of Education, Government of India, and this is being organized jointly by Chanakya University and the Center for Human Sciences, Rishihood University. And for the inaugural session, we have with us Professor Shobhit Mathur ji. He is the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Rishihood University. We also have with us Professor M.S. Chitra ji, MS Chaitra ji. He is the Director, Center for Study of Cultures, and he is also the Director of Arohi Research Foundation. He is the Program Coordinator and Associate Professor at Chanakya University. We also have with us Professor Sampadananda Mishra ji. He is the Director, Center for Human Sciences, Rishihood University. And with this, I would like to request all our three guests to come forward for the Prajwalan. मैं अपने सभी अतिथियों से अनुरोध करूंगा कि कृपया वो मंच पर आएं और अपना स्थान ग्रहण करें। मैं प्रोफेसर चैत्रा जी से अनुरोध करूंगा कि कृपया वो शोभित माथुर जी को किताब भेंट करके उनका स्वागत करें। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद सर। अब मैं प्रोफेसर संपदानंद मिश्रा जी से अनुरोध करूंगा कि कृपया वो मंच पे आएं और स्वागत उद्बोधन दें।
Oh, namaskar to all of you. It's a great moment for all of us. We have gathered here to be a part of this ongoing workshop on translation and culture initiated by the Center for Indian Culture at Chanakya University and sponsored by Bharatiya Bhasha Samiti. Language, when we speak, like every nation, हर देश जो है उसकी अपनी भाषा या अपनी भाषाएं। जब भारत के बारे में हम बोलते हैं तो भारत की स्थिति अन्य देशों से बहुत ही अलग है, क्योंकि यहाँ की विविधता, विविध भाषाएं। फिर भी इन विविध भाषाओं के भीतर एक एकत्व का सूत्र है जो फंडामेंटल प्रिंसिपल्स ऑफ लैंग्वेजेस है, which are in alignment with whatever the language may be, regional language may be, whether it is Tamil or Telugu or Kannada or Malayalam or Odia or Bengali or Marathi or Gujarati or any languages. We have more than 700 languages, including dialects and subdialects. But there are certain fundamental principles which is common to all the languages, the nature of the language and the way we use the language. And it is extremely difficult when it comes to translation. It's not just translation of the words, the phrases, the sentences, but translation of ideas. Translating the Upanishads, translating the works of Kalidas, or on translating Kalidas when Sri Aurobindo had to speak. So he said that translating any text to English or any European language is an impossibility. Same is the case when we start translating from any European language to Indian languages. But here risk is little less. So why it is important that we need to understand the association, the cultural association, the social, religious, political, all kinds of associations we need to take into consideration when we are talking about translation. And especially to understand the language properly, the context properly, and then where we need to translate and what we need to translate. And we can build our own theories of translation when we have a mission to achieve. For example, like I'll give you what kind of problems happen in translations. I was sent some of the works of Sri Aurobindo, which are originally in English and very tough to translate, very tough to read and understand, and how ridiculous the content, the shape of the content becomes when it gets translated into any regional language. So, there is a line in Savitri, it said, "Thou art." Now, just understand this phrase. Any person will uh, understand "thou art." It is written in the sense of "you are," right? But someone translating it into Hindi is putting it "tum kala ho." How will someone understand? The entire text, context, the force of the language is lost. There's another line. So while reviewing, I had a lot of fun. At the same time, I was shocked ki what harm or translation can do. There's a phrase, again, Sri Aurobindo is writing, you must allow your thoughts while meditating. So you should not worry about why so many thoughts are coming. So you should allow your thoughts and just observe. And then after some times, you will see that your thoughts are running down. They run down. Now, run down is a phrasal verb which is used in the sense of it gets exhausted. But the person who has translated it, he has translated तो अपनी चिंताओं को नीचे की ओर भागने देना, run down. And this is the kind of horrible translations you will find in almost every translation. So it is necessary that we understand the language properly, at the same time, the context properly. I gave you the examples of language. And whatever statement is there, if a translator or interpreter wants to interpret it differently, translate the ideas differently, he can give a very wrong twist. I'll give you one example that once Pope was there in America and he was careful about the American journalists, how they twist things. So when he arrived, immediately the journalists asked, one of the reporters asked him, would you like to visit some of the nude clubs in America? So he was in a fix. He was unable to answer anything, yes or no. But he somehow he managed saying that, are there nude clubs in this civilized country? So everyone was kept quiet. But next day it was a shock to Pope when the headlines were Pope inquired. So you can interpret and translate things the way you want to give a twist. I'll give you the famous examples which I keep sharing in almost every conversation of mine connected with translation. There is a book on the life of Ramakrishna Paramahansa. The very title is Ramakrishna, the Great Swan. Paramahansa. Parama, great, Hansa, swan. Similarly, Shivaji is presented as the Lord of Umbrella, Chhatrapati. That's why context and culture association is very much necessary to understand. And I'm not telling you jokes, these are the real life stories. You can search in the internet, you will find these articles and books written about Ramakrishna, about Shivaji. So why it is necessary that this association, cultural association, and when we are producing texts, either from regional languages to English or any European language, even from regional languages to other regional languages. Every language is unique. I find it difficult when I try to translate even some texts from Odia, from Hindi to Sanskrit. Though they are all derived and they have a lot of connection with each other, yet the unique phrases is very difficult to translate. So you have to almost spend much time, much words, write a special note to explain those unique features, idioms, special phrases, which are unique to that particular language. We say that ये तो पंजाबी लोग समझ पाएंगे ये वाला joke. ये एस्पेक्ट जो है गुजराती लोग अच्छे से समझ पाएंगे, others we have to interpret it. So even translating from regional languages to regional language also there is difficulty. We need to understand the local cultures, the folk cultures, the folk ideas. So translation is a very, very difficult task where we need to concentrate on many aspects. So with these few words, I welcome you all, and then I hope that we will have a great time in these 2 days exploring various dimensions of culture and translation. And when we go back, we must be in a position to produce something and then offer something to the policymakers, to the government of India, to Bhasha Samiti, that yes, we have done something which will be very useful in taking forward the work of translation. Thank you all.
थैंक यू वेरी मच सर, हमें समझाने के लिए कि ट्रांसलेशन में कल्चर और कॉन्टेक्स्ट का क्या महत्व है। इसी के साथ अब मैं प्रोफेसर चैत्रा जी से अनुरोध करूंगा कि वो आएं और इस वर्कशॉप के बारे में और इसकी क्या आवश्यकता है इसके बारे में हमें समझाएं।
Good morning to you all, Adaraniya Shobhit ji, Sampadananda ji, and my friends, and some more people who are on the way, so they will be reaching here soon. My task is to just introduce you the why and what of this workshop. जो ट्रांसलेशन की जो मुद्दे हैं इन्होंने संपदानंद जी ने टोन तो सेट किया है, क्या इश्यूज है. See, one of the crises that we have today is that when we talk about our own selves as Indians, now, though we are talking in Indian languages today, now we don't seem to be talking in the straightforward, in a simple way that is comprehensible and understandable to each other. When every time when I come to North India and also in Kannada, for example, where I live, Karnataka, I pick up the regional language newspapers. I read something very funny and peculiar, which are not understandable. In the sense, for example, there is always a discussion about dharmik sangharsh. Now, it is very funny to know what the hell that phenomena is. Now we talk about, various things about psychology of human being, manasu, buddhi, chitta, ahankara, ये सब चीज़ें यूज़ होता है हमारे ऑर्डिनरी न्यूज़पेपर्स में, टीवी डिबेट्स में तो उसकी हद होती है. जैसे शाम में अगर रिपब्लिक या टाइम्स नाउ में यू यूज़ कॉन्शियंस कीपर्स, तो उसका क्या हो सकता है इन भारतीय भाषाओं में. तो कुछ लोग ने बोला मुझे आत्मसाक्षी हो सकता है. वो क्या होता है आत्मसाक्षी चीज़. So this very the most ordinary thing that we converse about our own selves, we have not realized that it is nothing to do with our lived realities in this world. Now, a lot of stories that we talk about today are actually part of the cultural experience of the Europe. And now they have become naturalized commonplace ideas of our day-to-day affair. Now we use it in one particular way and we assume that it is understandable, we understood it. And most often it is not. As a consequence, there is a crisis in terms of breaking down of communication. There is a lot of violence. We are unable to negotiate and solve our own problems in the world. And there is a fundamental crisis that we have at the level of usage of our language. If I see this generation people who are in the undergraduate education, they can't even express their emotion properly. The maximum number of words that they have is it's cool. There is nothing much that they can. And if you ask me for the same experience, my description in Kannada, in Hindi, would be terrific. I mean, even English, my English, though I was a Kannada medium student, I have much better option to articulate. And my generations next to me seem to have terrific difficulty in articulating their own selves. Now, given this crisis, we must realize that this crisis is not something that is built because of some bad teaching in the classroom. There is much more deeper problem which began much older, but there is a historical moment at which this problem began in India, which was 1835, British India Education Act. So we are hitting almost 2 centuries of British education system, and me and you, all of us are part of that education system. Now, so we have a task in front of us by 2035, when we hit 200 years, at least at that point in time, we should be able to think about how do we change this structure and functions of education in such a way that is useful to our own survival, our own very existence in the world. We have to live happily in this world. And how do we transform our education infrastructure in such a way that we live happy life? In order to do that, there are so many things that needs to be done. I mean, not one people, 2 people can actually bring in such transformation. There are so many issues starting from the structures, authority, administration, to pedagogy, to everything. But there is one issue which is at the heart of this issue, is that we all know globally that you learn things better in the languages that you know, you're familiar with. So in order to bring education in regional languages becomes the heart of the crisis that we are actually suffering to. Now, if you ask that way, even today, for example, every year I keep looking at education statistics in Karnataka state. Now, there are around 6 lakh students who pass 12th grade every year, roughly. Now, of which about 4 lakh students come from regional towns, Kannada medium, Telugu medium, and some of these kind of schools. So what is the problem that you're talking about? Already we have so many Hindi medium, Kannada medium, etc. Now the point is that we have simply translated English books in Kannada or narrated them in Kannada. Now in order to make a language accessible for knowledge production, knowledge transmission, it is not simple translation of one English book to Kannada. There is something else that is required. There has to be a contextualization of that, which requires a lot of thinking. In order to do so, one of the most important aspects that we are going to hit is translating large number of text into regional languages in a manner that is usable by the education system. Today we don't have them. Now this task is of multifold. For example, we need to bring lot of material from Sanskrita, Pali, Prakrita to Indian languages. There has to be cross-fertilization between various Indian languages to Indian languages, Kannada to Tamil, Bengali to Kannada. For instance, we have in Kannada, we have a large amount of translation of Bengali that used to happen to Kannada. Odia used to happen to Kannada, and suddenly it got stopped. Because now if someone has to do it, there are no Bengali scholars in Karnataka. They have to read an English version and bring that, and it has its own complication in order to do that. So this cross-fertilization is limited, and then we have to bring in content from European languages to Indian languages and Indian languages to European languages. If we produce knowledge, it's our responsibility that we make this knowledge accessible in other languages as well. Therefore, we need to produce our knowledge that is being produced in the regional languages to the European languages. Now, if you look at the amount of task that we have in front of us, the number of translators are not language experts. See, just because you know language doesn't mean that you can translate. Because translation is not dictionary problem. Translation is always requires a deeper understanding of experience and knowledge. Now we actually mistakenly understand it as some kind of a linguistic expertise, which is much deeper and beyond that. Of course, linguistic expertise is fundamental to that. Now, if you want to do that, we are limited by manpower, and even if you create manpower, we are limited by financial resources to supplement that. Because we are 140 crore people country. The huge, everything, anything that you talk in India will become millions. So therefore, Government of India has been trying to invest its energy in developing machine translation labs. Machines, government believes that machine is going to solve problem. But if you look at the machine translation, there are varying range of machine translations that are available. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, or something that you're very familiar, to a range of specialized machine translations which are available, like the Udan. There is one, Chennai, there is a center. There are half a dozen such center, including triple ITs, who have been involved in it. Now, these are also very crucial for us because we need machines to aid this process, because one, it reduces the cost. Second, I know it increases the efficiency, etc., etc. Experience can be stored in machine in far richer. Otherwise, human teaching institutions are very expensive when compared to machine. Therefore, we need to encourage them. But unfortunately, the underlying theories on which the machine learning have been built, machine translations have been built, seem to be deeply problematic, because the machine, invariably, almost all the machine translators consider translation as a language problem. There lies the problem. So we need to rethink about the nature of machines' involvement in translation, because at the end of the day, we need to bring content in Indian language for the learners in education in India. Because you must know, at undergraduate level, keeping aside 1,000 plus universities, there are 40,000 colleges in India. There are all kinds of courses. So we need content to be produced in all parts of this country, for which there is a crisis. Therefore, if we want to actually see our future to address to some of this problem, let's say by 2035, we wanted to visualize a dream of providing alternative in education sector and make education more useful to us. If we want to do that, one of the key area is going to be translation, and which we can't escape. Whether we like it or not, we have to confront this problem. So one of the point that Chanakya University as an institution, which is interested in actually committing to Indian knowledge system, it is interested in reflecting about, we produce something which is locally useful, globally accessible to all kind of people, that we wanted to communicate to people what issues could be really the problematic issues in translation. We wanted to actually draw attention of certain people who can talk about, who can reflect about, who can comment about, who can write and build a discourse around it, build a narrative around it in such a way that people could force the governments and other agencies to reflect in an appropriate direction, to develop probable strategies around the issues of language and translation. So given this background, we have this orientation workshop today. And how this orientation workshop is going to do? This workshop will actually have 5 major sessions. None of them, though there will be people who will be talking, none of them will have fully lecture format. Now, there has to be a conversation between the participants and the ideas that needs to be worked out. So in this, one session would really focus on the very idea of language, and its relationship to knowledge and experience will be explored in the one session. And then one of the very important thing is that we have absolutely forgotten about our history of education in India. 200 years, what is our journey in education and what happens to Indian languages in this journey of education that we have traveled as one session. And there will be very focused sessions which will look at translation 1, focusing on Sanskrita. Now, in last 200-300 years of translation effort between Sanskrita to English and English to Sanskrita, what disastrous ramification it has produced in understanding India and developing an image of India. And there will be another illustration which will have the translation between Indian languages, largely Kannada to English, English to Kannada, and how it fundamentally, 200 years of efforts, I mean, the structures that were developed because of colonialism has altered very nature of our language today. I mean, it's something that we don't realize, that how these have been hampered very badly. Now, and then we will have some kind of reflection and discussion around the machine translation. I mean, this is the overall structure, and most of the structure is not in a very rigorous lecture and you have to listen kind of a thing. The whole idea of the workshop itself is to draw a lot of conversation. So we will do it in that conversation mode and bring back this question of language to the foreground, because any culture more so with Indian culture, is fundamentally one of the most important part of preserving, nurturing, and enriching this culture is preserving, nurturing, and developing the language. There is a very direct relationship between the language and the culture. Now, but this is not so much in terms of just linguistic sentence and grammar, but much more about the knowledge that that culture has produced in this world, about the experience that it has actually encompassed in it, which is knowledge not just for Indians, but knowledge for the humanity. Because our ancestors, when they wrote, they never wrote it for Indians. They wrote it for human beings. Sometimes our ancestors were so visionary, such a visionaries that they didn't even write for human beings. For Jiva, for all Jivi, is what was their ideas were actually thrashed out, reflected around that larger canvas. And we need to get back to this issue of the language, because that is what drives and sustains what we are as Indians. And that is the heart of our culture. And if we want to retain this, one of the significant things is to get back to this focus on languages. So this is what is the overarching structure of the workshop. With this introduction, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for explaining us how translation is important and how by 2035 translation can help us in Indianizing the education. And you also explained the structure of this workshop. And with this, I would like to invite Professor Shobhit Mathurji to address us on this important occasion.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to this conference, this workshop, as well as to Delhi. Yesterday we had some guests from across the country come at Rishihood University, and particularly the ones who had come from southern part of India were very worried about the weather in Delhi, because any small thing that happens in Delhi becomes breaking news in India and everybody's worried. But you took the brave step of coming here. I hope it is comfortable. To begin with, I would want to actually first of all congratulate Chanakya University for taking up this initiative, and Rishihood University, the Center for Human Sciences, for supporting it. Because something like translation and culture, I come from the STEM background, but these are some things which we assume to be very obvious. We don't pay too much attention to. But the way Chaitra ji completely put the context, and before that Sampadananda ji, it is something so fundamental to us, and because it is so obvious, many times we don't even give it too much importance. But to take a subtle idea like this and bring forward its complexities, the challenges, and how it plays a very fundamental role in the very way we look at the world, I think that is a very commendable initiative, and we are glad to be a part of it. I was just going through the concept note, and I made some of my observations on that. So to begin with, language, I see a very important line, is important to access and transmit knowledge. For example, if I didn't have this means to communicate with you, this whole workshop would not have happened, like this whole world would not exist. It is such a fundamental thing that not just to access, but also to transmit knowledge, language is so fundamental, right? And it begins right from our birth. In fact, before our birth, right? When we are in our mother's womb, when we start listening to what our mom is speaking, we start picking up language right from that age. But somehow we are not very conscious about it. And naturally, when we say it is the means to access and transmit knowledge, education becomes a very core part of it, because knowledge comes through education, and it is two academic institutions that have partnered to make this initiative possible. Now, to just rewind a bit back, and translation being very important again, see, I'm choosing to speak in English because though my mother tongue is Hindi, I also can speak in Telugu, a little bit of Sanskrit I have picked up on the way, but still at this stage of my life, it has come to a point where I start thinking only in English. I don't know how many of you have this phenomenon like me, though we have kind of left. So if I have to speak in Hindi, other than conversational Hindi, in formal setups like this, I will have to do a very conscious translation in my mind. I'll have to think in English, translate in Hindi, and then communicate it, which will create a very big cognitive load. To the state where also possibly I dream in English. I don't know if we think of what we are dreaming, the language we are dreaming. So it has become a part of my life. Because of course, I also went to the US, I lived there. Primarily, it's all English. So the last perhaps 15 years or 20 years of my life has been only English conversations. So that is how language has kind of just changed me fundamentally as a person, which this would not be about maybe more than 10-15 years back. This is not there, but it has happened to me now. And it's unfortunate or fortunate, this is the language that I'm using to communicate with all of you now. So another thing which has been mentioned is about how do we make this whole thing about language, education, particularly higher education. And I think one thing that has also been, my personal area of interest is the Indian judiciary, for example. The higher judiciary, the higher education is completely in English. And we as academic institutions, I think it is very, very important that we are very conscious of this, because when I was at IIT, what I noticed is perhaps the smartest kids who write the entrance exams in their local languages. I mean, it's perhaps the toughest exam in the world, right? You make it through to good institutions in India, and then you don't succeed. In fact, you go through a very bad phase academically, purely because the day you enter the classroom, the faculty member there is speaking in English, and you have not been exposed to this your whole life. So this whole effort of listening in English, somehow trying to translate it in your mother tongue, trying to make sense. In the exam, again, you will think in your mother tongue, then try to write in English. Obviously, you will not do as well as you should be doing. And I think the hidden statistic is, which has not been explored enough. It is usually given a caste angle, but it's not a caste angle as much. The reason for suicides in IITs and IITs just next door to us is possibly also language, because this is such a fun. You immediately get a sense of inferiority complex. Your friend circle changes, everything changes, especially when you go into higher education. And the same thing is true for the judiciary. Even we, as educated in English, we cannot make sense of 200 words of a Supreme Court judgment. It doesn't make any sense to us what is written there. We need a translator called a lawyer or an advocate who will tell us what is written there. An entire profession has been created purely because even within the language there is a hierarchy. Somebody speaks in some language which doesn't make any sense to anybody, right? And nobody is talking about this. Then this is a very important pillar of the Indian government, right? To have the judiciary, and it is in a language you can't even write your petition in your mother tongue beyond the district courts. Once you go to high courts and Supreme Court, it doesn't work. There are rare exceptions, right? So I think that is something which is very, very important, and we should understand. There's a bit mentioned about, I think, how do we do this translation and the requirement for good manpower and resources that Chaitra ji mentioned. Recently, the Center for Human Sciences at Rishihood has taken up a project to translate some very important works of Ganpati Muni into Hindi and English. They're all in Sanskrit, compiled by Sampadananda ji. Now, I mean, we would assume that this knowledge, which is so important and has come out from a Rishi's thought, people would be looking forward to translate into languages. It has been an immense challenge, I can confess here, because we have not been able to find enough translators. Imagine the tragedy that a knowledge is locked in a language and you cannot unlock it because you don't have enough translators. And as Chaitra ji mentioned, they are not just language to language translation. We have to understand the context as well and translate it. So imagine when we say we are the oldest living civilization, for a few millennia we have existed, so much knowledge is just stayed locked in Sanskrit language, in Pali, in various other Indian languages, and somehow we are not able to translate it and bring it into our current popular languages. So, I mean, that's a tragedy as a civilization if we cannot do it. Some other countries have done it very well. We all keep talking about how Israel has done it, how they have revived a dead language. 1,000-year-old dead Hebrew language was revived. An entire nation was built I mean, I had fascinating experiences about this. I was in Europe briefly to intern during my undergrad studies. We had a Jewish professor. I mean, every day the conscious attempt she makes in teaching her children Hebrew. Even though they are in France, they may not go back to Israel, but then the attempt that this language has to be kept alive. I mean, that very small population of perhaps, I mean, a few lakhs, right? And they are taking this effort to keep their language alive. I think that is something which we all have to appreciate. Uh, and then there's a point mentioned about language, culture. I'll try to bring it through my personal experience. So when I went to the US, um, around September 2004, I was there. Immediately in October, there was Navaratri celebrations. Now, Navaratri celebrations, Indian community is big, so you do dandiya is the most common thing to engage youth. So you start with a small arti of Devi and you start the dandiya. So to explain the idea of a Devi, I had not even experienced it to a white person. It's so difficult because in their entire cultural slash religious context, there is no goddess. I didn't realize this. So I'm trying to say she's a goddess. So they're like, kya goddess? Matlab, God to matlab is male, right? In Abrahamic religions. So I was just, I again think of this because I have coming from a STEM background, from a urban setting, going to US. We have an assumption that they are far more advanced. They have more exposure of the world than us. But a very subtle concept like this, I was unable to explain. And then finally, it will become some Indiana Jones thinky, some pagan tradition that is doing something, right? So, such an interesting thing that I just a very fundamental thing in this country of Devi, Shakti. You cannot explain it to a person who has no concept of this in their thing. So, how do you do this? I mean, one way to say is, as the concept note says, it's untranslatable, and you just use it that way, or then you use the word as it is. But this doesn't work. We'll have to find ways to do this. Um, and it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge for the Indian diaspora globally. But I'll tell you a different experience that I had. So I briefly interned as a Seva full timer in a small country called Suriname in South America. Now, I don't know, many of you might know Suriname. It's a small country on top of Brazil. Okay. But the interesting part about Suriname is people from eastern India, typically eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, went there as slaves um, about 120, 30 years back. Okay, perhaps even before Swami Vivekananda took Hinduism to the West. So they were there. Now, the interesting part about Suriname is Suriname borders a country called Guyana. I mean, these names you'll keep hearing, Suriname, Guyana, their borders. They were colonized by different countries. Suriname was colonized by the Dutch and Guyana was colonized by the British. To understand the impact on India, I understood there. Somehow the Dutch were a bit more benign. So still to this day, there's a mix of Bhojpuri, Awadhi, Dutch spoken in Suriname. But in Guyana, it is lost. The British, I think, are very, very conscious about how to destroy an education system. Same country, I mean, very similar geographies, very similar populations, just colonized by two different forces, and you can see the impact. To this day, on a Tuesday, the entire Suriname community, the Hindu community there, is in the temple reading the Ram Charitra Manas. Why? Because when they were taken as slaves, put on boats, and they had to go, they were not allowed to carry any belongings because you would want to stuff as many people as possible on a boat. Right? They don't care if people die or whatever happens. So the only possession they carried with them was the Tulsi Ramayana or the Ramcharitra Manas. That tradition to this day, 130, 140 years later, still is kept alive. I mean, and somehow the colonizers have allowed it to happen, at least the Dutch. But in Guyana, you don't find it as much. I mean, the impact of colonization on language and things like that is, I mean, fascinating when you see the global context, how colonization has happened. You'll probably be able to think about what happened to India as well. Right. So, I mean, I don't want to take it too long. I mean, a very, very important, very interesting workshop in front of us. But me being an engineer, always whenever a problem I understand very well, our tendency is to look for a solution. Somehow that is very different from the humanities folks. The problem is specified very well, but what do we do about this, right? We are geared or always trained. Perhaps it goes in our mind. Solution kya hai ji, right? So, so I mean, it's an important thing, but how do we do this? Particularly, as even Chaitra ji mentioned briefly, in the current context. So for example, now as Rishihood University, I also formally teach. The challenge is, even though we may do excellent translations, I don't know, right? The ability to read has dropped drastically, right? So you cannot read 500 words at a stretch. I mean, when I see the young people today, so what do we do about this? Because we are putting our efforts, but ultimately it is for a purpose, right? So what happens there? How do we improve the reading ability of the young students that we have? And I know it's happening through education, from schooling, a bit of parenting issues. So we'll also have to think about that, because eventually we would want this. I think the maximum content being consumed today is audio and video. So when we think of translation, we should also possibly think of how we can, because there I don't think the translation has to be verbatim. Maybe you could add some context and do some things. Especially for audio and video content, you have to think a lot about it. You mentioned it briefly, but I think it is very important that and we don't have to think about it as man versus machine. Oh, so we don't have great translators, machines are also not good enough, so are we lost? I think somehow we have to start thinking how we can use machines. And I think you also mentioned the project Udan, because I'm also from IIT Bombay and I know Ganesh very well. So you make the machine do the heavy lifting, and then the human intervention happens. So I think that is a very interesting way to see how we can use machines rather than one replacing the other and both of them not being good enough. So I think that is one more approach I think we should think about, that whatever is emerging as AI, machine learning, and things will start getting better. And I think these translations will start getting better as we start giving feedback to it as well. But eventually we will need to use them and then fill the gaps wherever we can, and that is how a lot of, I think, the costs and deficiencies can come in. I think in terms of research publications, that is also a topic which we have not spoken too much about. The maximum research publications are in English. So if you do great research in your regional language, there is very little opportunity to get published. And all the eminence or prestige comes by publishing in English journals which are international. So I've seen this struggle of, but many other countries have been able to solve it. It's not that China is not publishing enough, or Japan is not publishing enough, or Korea is not publishing, they're all publishing. But how do you break this barrier of our scholars, our traditional scholars, writing in great journals and big journals and getting, taking our voice out to the international community? So I think the hegemony of publications in English has to somewhere be broken. Publication houses, I think that's also a challenge that we have. How many of us even know about a best Hindi bestseller or a Kannada bestseller? We don't know, right? But we all know about the English bestseller because Bloomsbury is publishing them, Penguin is publishing them. We don't have great publishers or big publishers. Perhaps it is lack of resources, perhaps it is lack of readership in the regional languages. So how do we create a good publication house that can, I know there are initial attempts that are happening in this direction, but we need a lot more of that happens. Then primarily also on reading and writing ability, I think we'll have to start working at a much younger age. I know this workshop is primarily for, I mean, all of us who are young adults in that sense, but how do we take these ideas to the school children as well? Right from that age, how do we inculcate this idea of just, so as he's saying, your vocabulary is limited. At best, you can say awesome and cool, and then you keep repeating that, and then the words make no sense anymore, right? Somehow, despite so much of information, content being available, the vocabulary has become so poor that we are unable to express. Possibly, we are better at expressing ourselves through memes, GIFs, emoticons, but not as much in words. So, this is a big problem, I think, that is coming up. So, how do we increase the richness of our vocabulary, take it to the school children? These are some larger issues we have to think about and find solutions for. And I hope the next 2 days of deliberation will focus on all this. Thank you everyone.
Thank you very much, sir, for addressing us and raising some very important issues. And I hope this workshop will address most of the issues that you have raised. And with this, I would like to thank, first of all, Bharatiya Bhasha Samiti and Professor Chamu Krishna Shastri ji and Chandan Srivastav ji because for making this entire event possible. I would like to thank Professor Chaitra ji and Professor Ashwini ji, Tilak Rao ji, and Aniruddh ji and the entire team from Chanakya University for organizing this event. Professor Shobhit Mathur ji, Professor Sampadananda Mishra ji, and our technical team for helping us in organizing this event. And last but not the least, our participants who have come here to make it a huge success. So I thank you all, and we will begin the first technical session in 5 minutes. And now we will close this inaugural session by observing a minute of silence.